Thank you for joining us. We are in the Lacuna Writers Room. We are building a setting to be used for fiction and media. I am Christopher Gray. I'm an author. I'm a game designer. With me is Dannie DeLisle. And who are you, Dannie?
I am a writer, an actor, all sorts of things. So I am here in those capacities.
The music that you just heard is an original composition by Ryan Franks, and the vocals are by Nina Story. This was composed specifically for Lacuna, and as you can tell, we're after a very epic kind of setting here. We're into episode 2, so we're just getting started on this project. And in the first episode, if you haven't watched or listened, that is, I think the best way to catch us right now is on YouTube. But we are streaming on Twitch and we are streaming on Facebook, but it's my Christopher Gray's personal Facebook because reasons. At some point, that's going to move over to the page that's on Facebook. And then we're also putting it out as a podcast. So if you'd rather listen, you can. And that's on everywhere that podcasts are. So that's how you find us. Now, we did this already, and we sort of explained what Lacuna is. And in short, you might want to catch out that episode because there's a lot in there about what Lacuna is. But in short, what we're doing is we're creating a setting using the gods of yore and mythology as actually as if they had come from Atlantis. And we're going to tell all of the stories that we can around that idea. So that's where we are. And Dannie, what were your thoughts about our I guess we did a design goals document mostly and kind of talked through it all.
Yeah, we did our design brief to kind of, at least the first draft of it. I mean, we mentioned that it's a leave-in document, really. But we have our initial first lay down of our vision for what Lacuna is. I think we nailed down some really good stuff. We did the design brief. We also did Lacuna is not, and Lacuna feels like. And so with those things, we have a pretty good, solid first base idea of where we're going. You talked about the inspiration for the setting. So now we can get into some timelines, like what happened when and how.
One of the containers we set up is that we had to be in our setting, we had to be consistent with mythology and consistent with history, or we had to be able to explain why it's inconsistent. So we're trying to we want to take a realistic stab at this. In other words, we just don't want to pull things out of thin air. So that means that we're going to have to kind of break out the timeline of when things happened on a big scale. Like when did Atlantis fall? What is that? What was going on in the rest of the world, and sort of build out a timeline. So yeah, we have to get into history now. You're into anthropology, right?
Mm-hmm. It's my undergraduate degree.
What was your? Did you do a thesis?
I didn't. Not for my bachelor's. No.
Not for the bachelor's. Oh yeah, undergraduate's bachelor's. All right, they should make you do that. If you had to do a thesis, what would it be on?
Oh gosh. Oh man, now you're asking me to pull the way back of what I was doing then. I've always been fascinated with, and it's kind of interesting because this kind of goes with Lacuna, but how stories change over time. I took a lot of mythology, cultural classes that kind of are based on that. And actually, my thesis in graduate school, when I did language and literature, was actually on a play called Juno and the Peacock. And I discussed the metaphorical similarities between that and Juno or Hera and the peacock myth. And even found some stuff from the author no one had seen before. So that was fun. So I've always been kind of interested in how we take stories and change them and how they are kind of evergreen in society. So I probably would have done something on that. You know, there's a reason why we tell, there are only 7 types of stories, or we see the same type of story over and over again, because they speak to us as humans, right? You know, the story of Hercules, you know, speaks to us, and the labors of Hercules and what happened, you know, to Romeo and Juliet, you know, stories we told over and over again in different ways. You know, I mean, Shakespeare is probably, I think, the biggest example of someone who gets modernized and changed a lot in terms of the story or how it's different. Like Pretty Woman, right? Was My Fair Lady, essentially. Like
right.
the Roberts movie was essentially My Fair Lady. Like, why do we take stories and want to kind of show? Because at the core, as long as you keep the core of the story, what's the emotional resonance of the story? What's the human character that we're talking about? That doesn't change over time. The trappings and how it is and how we might handle it in different time periods are, but the core of the story and the emotional resonance usually doesn't. And so I probably would have been something like that about why we retell stories and why we feel compelled to.
Well, that's so interesting, given that you're involved in the Lacuna project, because it's essentially what Lacuna is doing is saying we're gonna look at mythology, find the through lines, and then try to create what the original story would have been, and kind of reverse engineer
instead of taking. Yeah,
right.
Yeah, that's right. I'm super excited about that.
That is really cool. Well, so my background is other than theater, because I'm very dramatic, is history. And I've always been a nerd about history. And I remember my favorite class in high school was AP Western Civilization. And I failed the class because I didn't do any of the homework, but I got the highest marks possible on the AP test. And my teacher was really angry at me for that.
Ooh.
But I mean, she's like, you couldn't pass the class. You couldn't do the work and pass the class, but you can pass the test, you know. And anyway, she was a lovely teacher. She opened up my eyes to history, because my first experience of realizing that history is stories, which sounds silly thinking on it now, but when you're in high school, you don't think of history that way. The first moment when I realized that history was actually storytelling was when she came in. She started her lecture by saying the First World War was actually not in the 20th century. It was 30 years long, and it started because 2 punk kids threw a monk out a window. And I'm like, I am listening.
Yes, indeed.
And it was like,
I mean, why wouldn't you at that point?
And so I have ruthlessly been stealing from history for my fiction ever since. I don't even come up with my own ideas. It's like I just grab things that actually happened.
When I was in high school, I had a world history class, and for our final thing for world history, you could choose some kind of project to do. He had a bunch of different options. You know, you could pick. You know, you could do a research paper. You can do this, that, the other thing. I wrote my own Greek myth for it. I actually have it. It's right here. And yeah, so any opportunity I had, because, you know, but yeah, in world history class, I wrote my own Greek myth.
That's amazing. Well, you're finding the trappings of mythology, and, you know, if you know the trappings.
Yeah. It was about Hermes falling in love with this mortal, and like, yeah, it was cool. I enjoyed it, and I was like 16, so, you know.
Well, history kind of took a backseat to my career, and, you know, and I sort of just did it as a hobby. But I think I missed my calling as a history teacher. The problem is, though, I don't know if I would be a good history teacher, because I'm always more focused on the story than on the actual history. Like, I'm way more interested in the story than in facts, right? So I will be very blasé about history and be completely wrong, you know, because the details don't matter. But the general stroke was that, you know, too many allies, too many friends got in the way, and so everybody said they would back each other up as friends, and then we had World War I, you know. And I couldn't tell you exactly what year, you know, decade even, but I can say why it happened and the story behind it, you know, and I can describe one of the biggest battles in World War I without having any idea where it is, or who was involved, right? I just know that what the moments were, the stories. So I'm actually really bad at history in a historical academic way, but I'm really good at it with the story. So that's why Lacuna is really attractive to me, because I can do just that. I don't have to be accurate. It just needs to be, consistent with reality.
Oh, now I feel the need, because it's right here.
For those of you listening and lost Danny's audio, she has jumped out of her table and is now digging furiously under her desk, and papers are flying, animals are scurrying. Oh, she's back. Okay, we have a piece of paper.
Anybody can see this? Yeah, it's
okay. So it's a document. Is that your myth?
Yeah, this is the story that I wrote.
Oh,
in high school, Hermes and Princess Maya. I got a 97. This is my teacher's note. Yeah, this is my teacher's note.
I can't believe you kept that. That's so neat.
Yeah,
I don't have anything from that decade ever. I think
I had the little. You can't see this, and everybody listening, but I'm a Virgo, so you can imagine that this has page protectors. Like it has plastic.
Why it's still here?
Page protectors. I even made a little art piece representing my story.
Yeah, it looks like a night sky with
it's a moon.
A moon and stars.
Because a myth usually used to explain something in real life. So in this case, Hermes had given Princess Maya a ring, and then when she died, he hung it around the moon. So when you see an aura around the moon, that is the ring that Hermes gave.
I love that's headcanon now. That's headcanon now. That's real. Oh, that's beautiful. I mean, you took the trappings of a myth, so it feels like a real myth.
Yeah.
It's something Hermes would do.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yep.
So, okay, that's why, we have history, we have anthropology, but in a hobbyist way, I guess. And we're going to try to be honest about this. It's interesting thing that you brought up in your grad school that you worked on linguistic, or at least language in a general way.
Yeah, English language and literature.
Language is really interesting to me too. And I went down the rabbit hole of it. There's this podcast called the History of the English Language. So it's history, which I nerd out about, but it's also language, which I nerd out about. And it's one of my favorite things is to explore language, the origin of words, the stories behind the words.
And about how we basically what's the phrase? We follow other languages down dark alleys and mug them for loose grammar.
It's so true. Well, one of the cool things, this is kind of a side rail, but one of the cool things about English is that you can spot by what word you're using the era in which it came from. And when you think about the word choices we make and the emotional inflection that those word choices have, is directly tied to the history of the language. I'll give you an example. If you are if you're dividing somebody up, there's a division, right?
Right.
It sounds much softer. Like you're just dividing them up. Maybe you're dividing their duties, right? That's Latin. That's kind of like
my horror mind went to actually cutting somebody
keep that
up
horror
and
mind.
Them.
Keep that horror mind. And this might be a bad example because you don't really divide people up, but just to think about using the word dividing when talking about people. Mm-hmm. That's dividing that came from the French Latin, which mm-hmm. means it was probably used by the regals and by the more affluent in society, and so it's a much nicer way of saying slash, which is another way of saying dividing. But slashing is much more violent. You're slashing a person rather than dividing them, or slashing their labor or whatever it is that corporations do. And you're slashing, so that actually came from the Viking influence. That's a Viking word. And that is has a kind of a horror, anger, rage, all of the things that Vikings represented to the English, right? Or to mm-hmm. the British. That you can just cut, which is just a simple way of saying something. And it's very root, right? It's just, I'm just going to cut this. It's like a primal word. Well, that mm-hmm. came from Old English. And that was like one of the more primal, original Indo-European rooted words. So you can actually, based on the emotion you want to tell, you can choose a word from the right era. Like if you want something to be scary, you choose a Viking word. If you want something to feel primal, you choose an Old English word. And if you want,
you're talking about the connotation of a word,
right?
Like what that word connotation versus the denotation. The denotation is the same thing.
It's the same thing.
The connotation, what it conjures in your mind, is very different. And yeah, writers do that all the time.
It's directly tied to its origin and history, though. That's what's fascinating to me.
Yeah.
And so if you're using a bunch of words from the Viking era, it's going to sound like an angry thing. And it's not because Vikings are angry. It's because the Britons were scared of Vikings and their words caused fear, and it got entrenched into the society. And that's why in English we have like 5 words for everything.
Right.
And instead of going to a thesaurus, I go to the language site. What's it called? I'll have to think about it and put it in the show notes. But there's a site about the origin of language, right? So I can go and look at the epistemology. But help me out. It's the science of language.
Right.
But I go to this site and when instead of a thesaurus, I'm going to the site and I'm looking at the origins of the word, so I can find a more precise word for the right emotion I'm trying to inflict. And I went on a side rail, but anyway, language is really cool to me, and we get to make language in Lacuna too. So I'm very excited about that.
We do.
Part of me just wants to jump to that, but we have to do other things first.
Well, that's why, remember I said in the beginning, or I said before we started the stream, that one of my favorite myths is Eros and Psyche, right? And part of what I love about the story is that it's so metaphorical, because Eros is love, a certain type of love. Psyche is the soul. And the literal names are love and soul. And so you're talking about love and soul coming together in a metaphorical way and all that sort of stuff. So there you go.
It's etymology online. That's what I was trying to think. It's called Etymonline or something like that. I'll find it and put it in the. I think I came up with a word that means the science of letter writing. I don't know. Ignore the other word I used.
Yes.
Epistemology.
You have epistolary. You have epistolary novels, which are like letters and things, stories told
like the Screwtape letters, right?
Yeah. Dracula. Yeah. Oh, cool. Yeah, etymology.
That's what I was trying to go for. And what's the study of insects? That's something that sounds like that.
The study of insects?
The study of insects or something like that.
Oh, gosh. And of course, now you asked me, it's going to fly out of my head.
This is the point where everybody tunes in and is like, who are these idiots? Anyway.
Who are these idiots? They don't know anything.
Let's go back to the topic on history. All right. So what we need to do is figure out the timeline of Atlantis, in particular, the fall of Atlantis. I think we need to nail that down, because what that means
entomology.
That's the study of insects.
Yes. Entomology, the study of bugs.
Epistemology does not exist, but I'm coining it as the study of letter writing.
There you go.
And etymology is the word I was looking for.
We found it. Thank you.
We're here every week, people. All right. So the reason we need to figure out when Atlantis fell is because that is going to be the moment the Europe and Asia have an influx of refugees. Mm-hmm. So we'll need to be able to correlate that diaspora with historical accounts. Mm-hmm. And there is one point in history that I think we can nail in right away. Mm-hmm. And that is the fall of the Bronze Age. Mm-hmm. Which was I should look this up. It was one particular year BC. Which I'm going to look it up because I don't want to misspeak on this. I think it was 1177, roughly 1200 BC. There's a book called, I think it's called 1177 BC, which is all about this. The Bronze Age was screaming. It was Europe and Eurasia were completely civilized. They were easily going from northern Africa all the way to Turkey without incident. They were trading. Everybody was doing really well. It was an extremely high point in society. All of these huge alliances were born. There were obviously a lot of wars and stuff, but then all of a sudden it just collapsed out of nowhere. And historians have been puzzled over this. And they've, I think some of the later historians in the last 20 years, 30 years have kind of pinpointed some of the cause. And a lot of it was economics. Like at some point, the economics weren't working and there was some climate change going on. But one of the things, and I don't care about all that. I care about the story, right? But one of the things that's really interesting to me about this is it's this invasion of the sea peoples. And when I first read about this, I was like, this has got to be made up. Like they didn't know what to call these people, so they called them the sea peoples. Nobody knew where they came from. And they just obliterated society. They started from the west and moved to the east. And by the time they landed in Egypt, they almost took down Egypt. And they took down like all of these other people as they went. And nobody knows who they are, where they came from, or why they're even called the sea peoples. That's coined because that's what the Egyptians called them. Nobody knows what they are. Okay, now when you look at the actual history, they're not all that different than Vikings. It was just a group of people that were raiding and pillaging that grew over time, and then that doesn't matter. I'm talking to the story.
In case we haven't said it, don't take history lessons from us.
No,
don't do that.
We are
because we're pulling what we want and all of that. So. Do not take history lessons from us.
We're looking for the story, not for the facts. Okay.
Right.
So, but anyway, it is interesting that, even though even academics who have studied this aren't exactly sure what's going on, there's a whole host of things that led to the fall of the Bronze Age. But the fact that it culminated in this year is really interesting to me. The fact that the sea peoples came across them. So I think that for Lacuna, that's a moment. The sea peoples are obviously refugees from Atlantis, bulldozing their way into society, right? Some of them are good, some of them are bad. Most of the time, they just knock things over as they went. And then I think it culminates in Troy.
Right.
And the Trojan War. And that's sort of where it all just comes to a head. So.
Or a horse, rather.
That's why I invited you to be on the stream, Danny. You keep me honest. Right. So I think
guys, they left us a gift. It's a big horse.
That's the point in history I think that we can pin. It's like, okay, the sea peoples, diaspora of Atlantis.
Which means that Atlantis would have happened like right around then. Right. And so everybody would have to come over to the other continent and be like, hey, if we have no continent anymore, we're going to take yours.
Right. Also. Or assimilate you or whatever it is that they do. Yeah. And I think that's why we get all
they're the Borg too? Can we start back into these myths?
Yeah. I mean, if they're acting like an organism, sure. But when we look at, I'm going to leave Egypt out of it for now, but when we look at Greek mythology, a lot of the Zeus Olympia stuff happened after the millennium BC. So the Trojan War mythos and stuff happened ish around this time. So it makes sense that the gods of Olympians are actually Atlanteans coming in and messing everything up.
And the stories they tell are stories of stuff that happened.
Right. You know? So I think that tracks.
Zeus just going around impregnating everybody, I mean, Ares just out there on the battlefield, Aphrodite being really hot. Like, yeah, I see
it. Hot because it's the Mediterranean climate. Oh, you mean, right.
Well, no, I mean, you can see it. If you think about the stories of the gods, it's like you have these people who are here, and then this other culture comes in that's very different from your own. I mean, what are you going to think? Right? And the behavior of a lot of the older gods, let's look at it this way, is very human-like. Okay, so we're not talking about like a monotheistic conception of God up in heaven and, all this stuff. You know what I'm saying? We're talking about the gods that were portrayed as human or having human-like flaws and qualities. Okay. So here's a thought that I had seen. So let's talk about, because I'm just basically what I'm doing is saying this is why that makes logical sense. Right. Because you have these gods, immortal. I mean, but we, for whatever reason, which we haven't discussed yet, why are they? Did they come from some, whatever? We haven't decided that yet, but they're immortal. They come onto this continent, and these people who are immortal, or who have not encountered them before, are getting these impressions of these gods because they're immortal, but like they're not omniscient. They're not they're not omnipotent, right? They have abilities and they have things that these mortals don't understand. So the stories that get told are told in that mythological sense. If you have a person from Atlantis who's immortal who comes on and is like, I like humans, I can sleep with them whenever I want, and I create all this chaos, you get stories about that, and there you have it. It's not some divine, whatever. It's just this immortal who is just like, or somebody who's preternaturally fast, perhaps. There you have Hermes, like they suddenly are just faster than a lot of other people, or, whatever. Or, you have, like I said, Aphrodite, somebody who just looks so different. And so, exotic, or you have Aries, somebody
they might have
really
technologies that come off as magic, as well.
Right. Exactly. And I read something at one point, which was, the gods are the way they are because they take on the dominion of their dominion, right? Why is Zeus temperamental? Because the god of storms are temperamental, right? Why does Hades take young women? Because death does that. The underworld does that, right? So what you have is, instead of saying, oh, they're the god of this, and we, attribute these qualities to them, what if in Lacuna, it's kind of the opposite? The humans that are seeing these things, oh, this guy's temperamental and he does this, that, and he has such a presence. Oh, he must be the god of storms.
Right. And he's got these lightning things.
Right. So he must be the god of storms, right? It's not something that they have taken on that they are. It's something that's been attributed to them via their abilities that their Atlantean abilities or their personalities. Oh, she's so beautiful. She must be the goddess of love and beauty.
Right.
That
makes sense. That makes more sense.
He's so good in battle. He must be the god of war.
Right.
Right. Yeah.
Right. We have a problem though with our initial timeline on this.
Oh.
And I said, let's put Egypt aside for a moment, and then said, this makes sense because the Greek, mythology is starting at about this time, the newer one, the one we know. But Egyptian mythology goes back to 3,000 years before that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I should probably look this up too, but I think the Ennead, which I'm mostly interested in terms of Egyptian mythology, Ennead is it means the 9 gods, and it's the main gods we know mostly.
Isis, Osiris, Ra, Anubis. Yeah.
And the Ennead is a relatively new mythology compared to the others, and actually I should probably look this up. But there were ones before that. When did Ennead? Let's see what our friend Google says. Yeah, okay, so Ennead was clocked in at about 2500 BC. So about 1,000 years before the Olympian mythology. We have the Ennead mythology, and that was kind of a new one. And before that, there were older ones that kind of died or were kind of absorbed by the Ennead. Mm-hmm. So the time frame doesn't quite work for Egypt. And it also doesn't work for Babylon and Assyria and all of those guys, because that mythology goes back to like 3,500 to 4,000 BC.
Right. Okay. Well, so here's where the pitching idea comes in. So let's talk about that timeline and how it might work. So you have our Atlantean people, gods, etc., on Atlantis, right? That doesn't necessarily mean they never left it before the diaspora, right?
Right.
You know, maybe they tried, maybe they were in Egypt for a little while and then they were like, either A, this is boring, or maybe someone convinced them that, hey, maybe we shouldn't be messing with these mortals and whatever. And then in Babylon, it was kind of like these were instances where they kind of tried to kind of make contact a little bit, like initial stuff, but then it really didn't kind of take hold until something happened in Atlantis. Like instead of that, it's kind of like, well, they did run into these Atlanteans, but it wasn't as like pervasive, or it was just pervasive in this one area because that's all they went. That's the only place they kind of went just to see. And then you start talking about, well, then why did they go back? And why did they venture out in the first place? So it's basically like you have a couple instances beforehand where they might have integrated, or someone just ran into them, perhaps. Maybe somebody goes to Atlantis somehow, and brings back stuff they saw. Who knows?
I think the answer might be in mythology. Because you're right. I mean, there must have been visitations into the mortal world all along.
Mm-hmm.
But the answers might be in mythology. Is how many myths, and you probably know more about mythology than I do, so I'm going to toss this over to you. How many myths include a story about some old god who's bitching about all of the mortals on in their front lawn?
Yeah.
Because it was Kronos, right? Hated mortals.
Right.
And there was even the Egyptians had a version of this, and it's eluding me. There was the Hebrew god. There was a version of this, right? The mortals getting on my nerves. There was and always in that story, it feels like there was somebody that defected and maybe helped the mortals out.
Right.
And we had the Prometheus story. And I'm drawing a blank on some of the others, but this is a pretty common theme, isn't it?
Well, in Hawaiian mythology, if you ever saw Moana, it was Maui.
Mm-hmm.
Was kind of the Prometheus figure who brought, if you remember the song The Rock sings, who brought the earth and the coconuts and all of this stuff. Maui was kind of like the Prometheus figure in native indigenous Hawaiian culture.
And I would argue, and this might get some hate, but there is some biblical study that the Hebrew god is the Prometheus figure of another goddom that was called the Council of Gods.
Right.
And that it was the Hebrew god El.
Yeah.
Which just means God, who helped out humanity.
Right. I mean, that makes sense. Let my people go. I'll send the plagues if you don't get, all this stuff. Yeah. No, I mean, it makes sense.
So maybe that's what happened. As I think, okay, another story, because remember the inspiration of this, a lot of this was Edgar Cayce when it comes to Atlantis and his prophecies. And he said, well, let's look at it. He said that there was not one cataclysm. And this is the wrong thing. I was looking at a map of an old world. There's not one cataclysm here. There were actually many.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going through the menu here of this really old website.
This brings me back to like early 2000s days.
Yeah, I think that's when it was made. It's not been updated. So like, okay. Maybe this isn't the right page. I'm looking through a page to see where there was one way back in like 10,000 BC, according to Casey,
mm-hmm.
which was a polar shift. And when I first read this, eons ago, I thought a polar shift, like if the poles of the Earth shifted, it creates a cataclysm. And I went down this whole rabbit hole, and there's just piles of conspiracy theories about the polar shift. But when scientists talk about the polar shift, they kind of shrug. They're like, well, sometimes the magnetic pole switch. And
but it doesn't do anything.
Right. They can see it in geological records. But Casey said that there was a big cataclysm from that. I'm going to find. I wish I had this set up first.
They're not being heard as well. Just FYI.
Yeah, I'm leaning in. That's
there
why.
You go.
But the one cataclysm he said that sank Atlantis was this comet that hit around Charleston, according to this guy who wrote this website. And he has some research on it, and that this comet would have hit around 10,000 BC, and it would have sunk the ocean floor. So that's this guy's position on it. 10,000 BC doesn't work for us, and we're talking Neolithic. People were just figuring out agriculture in parts of the world, I guess. But I mean, the world didn't look anything like the world of antiquity that I'm interested in. So that doesn't work for me.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's way too early for the cataclysm. But it's possible that there were multiple events.
Right. And the thing is like, since we're talking stories, it's like, oh yeah, well, that's what this guy says. But what actually happened was it wasn't as bad as he said. Yeah, some stuff happened and some people had to make contact with mortals and stuff like that. But it wasn't exactly like this,
I wish I could find, there was one page that had a list of all of the cataclysms. It almost doesn't matter. I mean, it's kind of comical, really. But let's look at the actual timeline of history here. So, according to Wikipedia, which is the extent of our academic research, at this point, we're looking at society as we know it not really happening until like 4,000 BC.
Right.
And then we had the beginnings of Egypt, the beginnings of the Britons, the beginning of the Celts, the beginnings of what would become the Mesopotamian region. And that's kind of when everything was getting started.
Mm-hmm.
So we have basically two benchmarks. It's the start of society kind of as we know it. And then there's that fall of the Bronze Age. Those are two pins that we can use in history, I think.
Right.
Maybe 3,500 BC and like, what did I say? It was 1177 BC or 1200 BC.
So we have 3,500 and then 1177, essentially.
Yeah.
As two pins in our timeline that were like, yeah, that's what we're looking at.
If you're listening to this, I'm just literally scrolling through Wikipedia called Timeline of Ancient History.
Yeah.
And just kind of points out all of the big stuff that happened.
Right.
And again, we're not going to go into all of this. This isn't the point of our world building exercise. We're just trying to get framework for when things happened and what happened.
Right. So, yeah. So those two things. So, and then we kind of talked about, well, what about things that happened before? And we kind of mentioned that, well, we can say that, those were just other encounters. Those were other meetings. But the really big shift when they actually came over to the mainland and Atlantis was gone was this one in 1177.
Here's what I think happened. I think this is, if we just read the tea leaves of the myths, right? What they're trying to say about these older gods getting cranky with mortals. And we look at ultimately many of these older gods getting overthrown by the younger ones. Let's say you're a Tolkien elf, all right? And you've lived, how long do Tolkien elves live?
Oh God, like Galadriel was like 8,000 years or something like that.
So you're like, let's say you're thousands of years old. And you're there in your city of Atlantis on the continent in the middle of the globe, literally.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, there've been these, because humans biologically have been around for, I think, like 300,000 years. So yeah, okay, there's these hairless primates all over that are, throwing rocks at each other and stuff. But whatever, we have our society. We're building our pyramids and everything that we're doing. And then you look over one day and suddenly you see the city of you
Yeah.
see these massive Egyptian cities being built, and you see all this stuff. Like, wait a minute, the mound built. When were the mound dwellers in the Midwest? I think they were probably around that time.
Mm.
So you see all over you, all these hairless primates are suddenly building a bunch of stuff and expanding and creating societies, and you're like, whoa, where is this going to lead? And to you, it's happening in a blink because you're thousands of years old. So what took a society 500 years to figure out for an Atlantean would have been overnight.
Right.
It's like it's like when you have an ant problem in the kitchen. You're like, oh, I found a couple of these ants in the kitchen. You turn your back and you look, and suddenly there's like a wall of ants going into your cupboard, right?
Yeah.
And that's probably so. What would you do? You're going to take your
right. You got to investigate. See what's happening.
Take down the ants before they take over your kitchen is what you're going to do.
Right.
So, and maybe the younger ones, try to stop them or try to help the humans. And they're trying to protect them from the older ones. I don't know. I mean, that would be a reason for them to be over there.
Right.
During the 3500s or whatever.
Right. So at this point, what do we need to write down and nail down and say, hey, this is what we're thinking?
I think, let me go into the whiteboard and then we can just start. I think what we do is we just put into years, moments, Atlantean moments.
Right.
And that might be all we need to do. And then when we come up with a story idea, we just need to decide where in the timeline it takes place.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense.
So I'm trying to find my my whiteboard here.
Yeah. So we've got just like a couple.
So we know that 3500 is sort of a moment. That's sort of the start of.
Yeah.
I want to call it start of civilization because there was civilization before then, but this was really when things started to get big.
Right. This is when, people started seeing each other and, all that stuff.
And then we had 1200 as the fall of the Bronze Age.
Yeah, the fall of the Bronze Age, the cataclysm. Yeah.
And when was Trojan War? Because I think that's kind of a culmination. It's about that time. They think it's about 1194. I think it culminates
12th or 13th century BC.
Culminates. I'm writing down 1200 Bronze Age collapse.
1135.
Wikipedia is saying 1194, but that's by an ancient historian.
Right.
But it'd be roughly the same time.
Right.
So we have those two moments. Those are probably the most significant moments in terms of actual history.
And then we have, in between that, other encounters with Atlanteans, with mortals, before and in between, the collapse. You just have other encounters. So, if somebody wanted to, they could set something before the collapse of Atlantis and the diaspora and the collapse of the Bronze Age and all that stuff. If they wanted to, smaller encounters or other encounters, lesser. Yeah.
So I'm typing between 3500 and 1200. There's in between lesser Atlantean influence.
Perfect.
So that's kind of like the three categories. Now, let's talk cataclysm.
Yeah, that's the next subject is what happened and why.
And I think the Sea Peoples and that sudden invasion probably was prompted by a cataclysm. I think that's when Atlantis, quote unquote, sank or was obliterated beyond repair and is now just the Azores. I don't know what kind of cosmic power it would take to sink a continent. The theory was that a comet hit and basically broke the ocean floor. I don't think it works like that. You get a crater, typically is what happens, and
Right.
a big cloud, and it's probably a tsunami. But so there might be something that we need to engineer for the collapse. I said they blew themselves up or something like that.
Well, here's what I was going to say, right? What if something happened, right? That, a cataclysm, meteor, earthquakes, lava, whatever happened on Atlantis, right? And it didn't sink it per se, right? But it caused it to be uninhabitable, right?
Mm-hmm.
But there were still like precious information, precious artifacts, things on the continent that perhaps the gods and the people, the Atlanteans, didn't want people to get a hold of. So they sank the continent themselves to prevent people from going over there and taking artifacts, perhaps, or information or stuff that they had over there. You know what I mean? I mean, maybe they were just petty. I don't know.
Right.
Like they were like, oh, well, if our place is screwed, nobody can have it sink.
Well, there might be a real risk of if humanity uncovered some of this stuff, there might be a real problem with that. Like one thing we discussed is, and this is something that Dannie and I have talked kind of offline, and we need to flesh out again later in a future episode. But one thing that we are pretty sure is true is that the original Atlanteans, were immortal, but their kids weren't. And so they had to make their kids immortal. And so there's some sort of process in which they did that. But here's the thing, if that process, when applied to humans, might have some bad effects or God knows what. So, right. It would figure that if something like this happened, that they would have to hide that. Like, look, you know what? Humans cannot get their hands on immortality.
Right.
It's too dangerous. And it's probably for self-preservation. We don't want them to take us over, but there also is probably some real horrible consequences for humans becoming immortal.
Right.
And we've discussed maybe taking that into vampirism or God knows what. I mean, that's future us's problem. But yeah, I can see that. I can see that being the case here. That's like, you know what? Let's just bury this stuff.
Right. Something happens. It destroyed a lot of crap. They can't live there anymore. And when they were there, they could protect it, right? At the very least, when they were living on the continent. But now that it's, uninhabitable and they got to leave, they want to make sure that no one's getting, access to this stuff. And it could be for a variety of reasons. Maybe like you pointed out all these reasons, but there's no reason that all of them couldn't be true because there's more than one Atlantean, right? Some of them are like, no, we should be the only ones to have this power. Some of them might be like, oh, it's too dangerous for humans. And they say that because they care.
Yeah. Right.
I mean, and you'd have a wide variety of reactions to that when they're talking about that, right? Because it's a collective cultural trauma.
Right.
And there's lots of cultures, lots of peoples that have collective cultural trauma. The Holocaust, the slave trade, are all examples of cultural trauma. So all of these Atlanteans are going to have experienced that when their stuff is destroyed by this event. And and I'm assuming it's just a big natural event because natural events can make places quite uninhabitable.
So what caused the break of Atlantis? It could be a natural event and it could be a war.
Yeah.
And we do know there's a war between the younger generation and the elders. And maybe it's a war that prompts a natural event or something like that. I think making
because
a war
they were trying to get at each other, so they're using whatever abilities they have, whatever technology they have to get at each other, and what they do is the equivalent of an Atlantean nuclear bomb.
Yeah, I think that's it. A civil war blows up Atlantis, basically. which
Yeah.
feeds into the mythology of hubris and all of that. It tracks.
Right.
And it could, we're over the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, so it wouldn't take much to summon a volcano or some damn thing, this would be, or a massive earthquake or whatever. They drill too deep, whatever it is, and that would topple the society.
Right. And then now they're left with this, and now their choice is, well, now that we've destroyed our own place, we can't let humans come here and potentially, whatever, get this information. So we gotta finish the job somehow. So they do. And then they're taking over, and as you said, spread across, the end of the Bronze Age and, the Sea Peoples, and then they're going across and, doing all that stuff after that. No, that makes sense.
So and we can bring in, probably the cause of the Civil War might have to do with humans themselves, and we can bring in the drama between elder and younger gods over
and
mortals.
Humans. Yeah.
Over the
that makes sense. I like that.
That would ultimately lead to Civil War. So this would have been
because as we talked about, you were saying, they're seeing like the mounds, they're seeing the pyramids go up, they're seeing this stuff. And so then now they're at a point where, okay, well, we can't ignore the humans any longer. What are we going to do about it?
Right.
And that's kind of the the trigger.
Yeah, that creates factions, and ultimately Civil War. And I like this better too, because that way, so many of the stories about Atlantis or aliens or any of these topics are really just, I'm just going to say it, they're racial coded, because they're like, oh, well, brown people couldn't have built pyramids, so obviously it was aliens. And I didn't want to get into Atlantis being responsible for civilization. They didn't build the pyramids in Egypt. I think they were alarmed about the building of the pyramids in Egypt.
Right, yeah.
And it kind of fed more into their own self-destruction.
Right. So, basically they were like, these middle in between 3,500 and 1,200, they're having this little influence. But by the time the Bronze Age is booming, the Atlanteans are like,
yeah.
what are we? So, their council or whoever, they're all getting together and they're all arguing about what they're going to do. Some are like, the humans should be immortal, or like, well, no, but we should take care. There's going to have all sorts of different opinions. Right. And that divides Atlantis, to the point, because they see their culture dying, especially the elder gods, Right. And so then that creates the big war. So they're doing all this, and then they're pulling out all their tech to see who's going to come out on top. And then they end up screwing over their own continent and all that. So.
It's beautiful. The other thing that's cool about it is I love the idea of some of the more prominent mortals in mythology may have been mortals on the Atlantis continent, as we could probably play with that. They had humans there too. One idea that I had kind of early on in this process is I love that idea of having Eden actually being a place in Atlantis where humans were being protected from other Atlanteans, like a refuge.
Well, as we're talking about in between, they had contact, right? So Atlanteans went over there, and it makes sense that the humans would find Atlantis too, and some of them are like, hey, we're going to stay here. And everyone's like, well, you're going to need a safe place because, a lot of Atlanteans don't want humans here. So
we don't take kindly to foreigners.
Right.
Right. So then the better Atlanteans then would have built a refuge, but that could be where the stories of Adam and Eve came from. That could be the stories. One idea I had of the Zeus story was having one of the children of Atlantis in this refuge acting as if they're a human to protect him from the other, because maybe he's like in the Zeus story, he was going to be the god that kills Kronos, right? So Kronos, so they whisked the baby away in the middle of the night and harbored him on some island somewhere. And then Zeus came of age and then toppled Kronos. So that was, but that story in Atlantis could be in Atlantis. It's like, Zeus was maybe put into this refuge thought he was human and then came out of it
Right.
to fight the Civil War, right? It's a really good story. It's a good origin story for Zeus. Now, when he turned into an asshole, I don't know how we're going to deal with that, but
well, power corrupts.
Yeah.
I mean, what are you going to say? You know, I mean, if you have so many people telling you what a badass you are, you know, for during the war or whatever, you know, it might go to your head a little bit. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah. But anyway, so
because they have human instincts or flaws as well and stuff. So, you know, if Zeus was this and he defeats Kronos or, you know, whoever and gets all this hero accolades or whatever, it may very well have gone, you know, to his head or other parts knowing Zeus.
That's just one example of, you know, taking mythology and putting it into this lens.
Right.
And then, you know, so I would be interested in telling the stories on the continent of events that lead up to the Civil War. That would be really interesting to me. So we'd have to decide who the elder gods are, who the younger gods are, who the mortals are.
Right.
And I think we only need to do that in the context of the stories we build. I don't know that we need to create. I've tried to do this, by the way, try to create correlations between all the different gods, between all the different mythologies. And that could be a whole doctoral thesis on its own. I mean, I'm not sure we need to do that work. I think we just need to do enough for the stories that we're working on.
Right. I mean, I think we have enough. I mean, I think this is good to let people play in.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? I think it's good. You know, drama between elder and younger gods over the topic of mortals. And we could just add a little note in there of like, because mortals, you know, the Bronze Age is booming and they're becoming more technological and stuff like that. And that's why, you know, and opinions differed. And then I think you have enough there to say, here's our timeline, start of civilization, in between Bronze Age, drama between younger gods and the immortals, and then the cataclysm, Civil War blows up Atlantis. Yeah. And I think that's enough. You know what I'm saying? And like, I think you're right about the characters in that. Tell us where you want to be. You know, what are you thinking when we tell you this timeline? What story do you want to tell? And like you were saying, I have some ideas about, you know, the Civil War and stuff. You'd write that and then, okay, good. This is what we have now. So I think you're right in that we don't need to set the characters.
Yeah. It's tempting, but I don't think we do. I think that might be taking away future creativity.
We can do that as writers. Right now, exactly. We're doing world building.
Right.
You and I, when we put on our writer hat and decide we're going to do that, that's when we're doing that. Right. That's when we're deciding who's going to be this, who's going to be that, etc.
And we're going to be strict about canon and continuity. So if it's established, a truth is established, all other writing will have to yes and that truth.
Right, exactly.
Or disavow it because of a reason, right?
But this is definitely enough to yes and for me anyway.
Right,
this is enough for, I mean, I've already got some ideas. So I can look at this and be like, this is cool. I got some ideas, you know? So,
and we're going to pretty early on probably establish some of the major characters in mythology. But the Civil War, for example, I don't know how long this war will be, all the events that would lead up to it, all what's going to happen on the war and everything. But I mean, you could potentially write 30 novels about this one Civil War. You know, there's so much there that you don't have to only look at top level. We could tell any number of stories that are happening in the Civil War setting without ever even leaving the continent, you know, and that's the idea. I think when I said before in the last episode that I had written 3 novels, the problem was it was only 3 novels and it was just too much there. I couldn't tell the whole story of Atlantis in a trilogy.
Right.
And so now I'm looking for the world to help. I think if all of us do it.
Right. No, I think this is cool. I think this is enough. And like I said, you have some ideas about the characters and who they were and stuff, but I think that's writer hat stuff. Yeah. I think that's writer stuff. This is what we have. We'll start it, and whatever we write, anyone who comes along, we can say, well, this is what we have so far that's canon for this time period.
Right.
Go from there. But having just this and saying this is kind of our established, I mean, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7 things. That's not much. And they're big, broad things. I think this is perfect to let people to start to dive into and actually really have a handle on making the lore and making the characters, because we want it to be character based. So if we want it to be character based, we really need to not establish the characters as the people writers room designing it. We need to let the writers, even if it's ourselves, do that.
I want to bring out a point you just saw about it being character based. I don't think we've made this explicitly told, but for Dannie and I, characters are going to be the most important part of the Lacuna project. We're spending a lot of time kind of figuring out the setting, but really what we're really interested in are the characters and their stories. We're less interested even about the plot or what happens to the character, way more interested in the characters themselves. So to the point where much of the fiction I plan on writing is going to be named after the character the fiction is focusing on, almost as if it were a comic book.
Our index is going to have it by characters, most likely.
Yeah, right.
What stories about those characters, because we want very much like in other universes is the author, whoever's creating it, will have authorship and rights over that character. They created that character. We're just creating this sandbox.
Right.
We're building the walls, we're putting the sand in it, and then you're bringing your toys and you're playing in it. You own those toys. You get to take them with you when you go. We own the sandbox. You own the toys. So anything that happens with those toys, that's you. That's all you. That's the writer. Yeah. I plan on creating a character. I have a couple ideas already, and those are going to be mine. Those are going to be my characters. And if anyone wants to use them or whatever, we can work that out. But, and then Chris is going to create some, other people are going to create some, and those are going to be our babies, our toys, that we get to play in the sandbox of Lacuna Inn.
Well put. And we're going to have processes for all of this. They're not built yet. We're just getting started. But yeah, that's the vision, and really well put. We're going to have to figure out a couple other things, I think, in broad strokes.
Maybe just as a thing, since this is super important, should we add it to our design brief as character based? Maybe in the Lacuna is or something like that. We should add it onto that. This is what we mean about living document, folks.
Yes, I actually changed the design brief this morning because I found a better word for one thing.
Okay,
and it's something that we should revisit. All boards. There it is.
Oh,
it's something we should revisit on a periodic basis because But what I changed was, let me move it over. Under Lacuna is not a cartoon, which we struggled with. I changed that to New Age. It's not New Age. Nothing against New Age. I love New Age. I kind of subscribe to a lot of it myself, but we don't want it to come off as the New Age ethereal Atlantis. I think that's what I was trying to communicate. That's more of a George R.R. Martin gritty Atlantis, right? So Lacuna, we're going to say that is character focused.
Character focused.
Now, these whiteboards are living on my computer, but I'm going to make them available to the community. And I'm going to do that in Discord. Yes, we have a Discord.
We do.
Nobody's in it yet except for me and Dannie. So please come to our Discord and help us out. But I'm going to start dropping this stuff into Discord and filing it there. And any of the other documents we create on these streams will be going there. So if you want to see them, go into Discord, say hi. If you want to start participating in Lacuna, Discord's a good place to start. We can start figuring out. If you want to be on this stream and help world build, Discord, come and join us, and we'll help you out.
Absolutely.
So
yes,
we have to now, and this is secretly very fun for me, and I'm very much looking forward to it. But we do have one more step, at least maybe two, but one more step for sure. And that is to figure out language. And now we don't have to invent the entire language. I think that's going to happen over time. But we have to figure out enough of the language so that we can create proper nouns for things.
Right.
As Atlanteans did not call Atlantis, Atlantis.
Right.
Plato called Atlantis, Atlantis. What is Atlantis's real name? What do they call themselves? What are the names of the cities?
Right.
You know, and we're not going to name the cities, but we're going to have a language architecture so that when we need a city, we can use our architecture to create the name.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's what we're going to spend next stream doing, kind of figuring out the language principles, coming up with what the words might be, and some of the linguistics behind those words. And then we'll use Discord to track the dictionaries. And as we come up with words, we'll put them in the dictionary. So that's going to be fun. I'm looking forward to that.
Okay. Cool. So we did timeline. I mean, we have about, you were going like 3 to 5, right? Or
yeah. Well, that was,
so
I think it might be more an hour and a half now that we've done it a couple times.
Yeah.
We might need to, and we can discuss this further. We might want to do more geography.
Okay.
To get an understanding of the continent and the climates. But, that's something we can do to later. I do think that the principles are here. We could probably start writing tomorrow if we wanted, but let's get this proper noun stuff figured out. Maybe we can jump into some story building.
Yeah. Sounds cool. One thing I will want to know that we haven't discussed, that is probably another kind of thing that we'll probably want to just establish, is why are the immortals immortal, and how do mortals become immortal? Yeah, I think that's another just big piece that we need to kind of discuss. And then once we have that, then
I think it's probably a magic and monsters, in a way. Like, we just need to figure out, and we might need to put some work into technology too. Figure out how this technology works, how immortality works, magic, if there is any, how it works, and monsters, if they are there, what are they? We don't need to do a monster manual, but I think we need to have an idea. Could there be such a thing like a Hydra?
Right. We just need to establish truths about where they come from.
When Horus goes into the underworld, is he slaying a giant snake? We need to figure that out.
Yeah. I feel like, and I'm kind of in love with the idea of two things that I would like to say. I think that the trials, which we've just been shorthand calling them, of people becoming immortal, right? Humans becoming immortal, or children of gods becoming immortal. Then we've been just kind of calling them trials. I think, one, they need to be very, very individualized, right? Because I always love, I personally, and this is just me as a consumer of entertainment and a storyteller and someone who runs RPGs, is that when you have something like that, everybody is so different, and all these gods, all these people, all these mortals that inhabit Atlantis or go to Atlantis or whatever are all so different, just like we are. So to have a very specific trial, very specific thing that every single person has to pass in order, I think, is not work. And more than that, then you can only tell one story.
Right.
Like, to make a trial story interesting, make it individual. Like, what is their trial going to be? It's actually testing for certain things, right? And we can kind of decide what those things are, or what that thing is. We can just say the trials to become immortal tests for these things in different ways.
And that's all the framework you need. When you think about the Elysian mysteries, I think I'd probably want to model a lot of this after mystery schools.
Right.
But that's what they were like. You are you're tailoring the program based on who's in it.
Yeah, I mean, one story that I have, I mean, I ran a vampire game, and one of the best sessions that I ran was when I had the Fae Queen. They had the Duchess, rather. She was the Duchess of Apples. Sent my players through the game of fear, she called it. And they each went into the room by themselves, and I role played with them, going through their character's worst fear.
Mm-hmm.
They loved it. Why? Because it was tailor-made for their character and who they were. It was testing for their ability to face their fear. But that's different for everybody. If you're testing for courage, that's going to be distant for anybody. If you're testing for willpower, that's going to be different for anybody. What tempts them to break their will? You know, what's going to break their will is going to be different for anybody. It could be temptation, could be pain, could be anything, right? So you have to figure out what quality or qualities are you testing for, and then make that individual. So that's one caveat I wanted to make about these trials.
Love it.
To become immortal is that they should be that of some kind, whatever it is. We just have to decide what they're testing for.
Right.
Because we don't even have to decide where it takes place. We don't even have to decide if there are other people involved in it. We don't have to decide that, right? It could be anything from this ancient god, we know, or the one who became God, known as Hercules, had to do these 12 labors and go to all these different places and do it. And that was his trial to become immortal. However, if you're writing a story that takes a modern place and you want to take a modern god, perhaps they just go into this weird store, right, at one point. And whatever they pick, what they choose to buy is their test. Like it, if you don't, we don't even have to define where it is. We just have to define what it's testing for. Are we testing for courage? Are we testing for determination? Are we testing for willpower? Are we testing for kindness in some aspect? What are we testing for? Kindness? Well, considering the gods, maybe not. But, I'm just saying, what are we testing for here? Or qualities, are we testing for? Or maybe it's just the fact that you have to have some kind of extraordinary quality. It doesn't matter what it is. And what you come out of it being able to do is based on that, right? Yeah. You either have to have, if you have extraordinary will, you can make it through. If you have extraordinary intelligence, you could make it through, but you have to be extraordinary in some way. And
these are the trials you have to take to become immortal if you are of immortal lineage.
Right.
Now, if you're not immortal and you are immortal taking it, I think that's when we can have some fun with, well, these are the this is what happens to you. There's always going to be a cost of some sort.
Right. And I like the idea of what you turn into, all the monsters exist. Loch Ness, freaking Godzilla, whoever, whatever, but all the monsters that are out there, chimeras, minotaurs, everything. And they're all the commonality is that they all failed the test somehow.
Yeah.
But either the way they failed the test or their lack of character and displayed during the test or something turn them into what they are now.
Yeah, I love it. I think that, we need to have a whole session just on figuring out these details.
Yeah.
And I think that the spine of this setting is immortality, really. And that's what we're talking about. And it's Atlantis, if Atlanteans were, and using Atlantis as a robe for that. So the idea of all of the magic, all of the monsters, all of the technology, everything's kind of centered around the idea of immortality. That's a cool. Oh, I can't hear you. You're talking, but there's.
Oh, sorry. I
There you are.
accidentally muted myself. Sorry. Then what I'm going to suggest, just as a thought to be percolating, we're talking about qualities, right?
Mm-hmm.
What if, since it's immortality that you are seeking, you have your reason for seeking immortality or your purpose has to be determined to be able to last, to be immortal, right? Perhaps that's something we can discuss in more detail as one of the parameters. Like being immortal is you watch people die around you and people you care about, and you're watching empires stand and fall. Perhaps the test to become immortal is you are tested in some way to determine if you have enough of a purpose in life, whether it be art, whether it be war, whether it be revenge. I mean, whatever it happens to be, it doesn't have to be, it's a neutral test, but that determination has to be enough to carry you through having an immortal life.
Oh, that's a cool idea.
That's a suggestion.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's jot that note down. We'll do this next session. We'll do on language, but then the session after that, let's tackle these issues.
And then I think after that sounds like we'd be pretty good to go to start writing.
We might want to do a geography lesson on Atlantis just to make sure that's put into canon. Because a lot of that's been thought through already. So we just need to make sure that we incorporate it into our stories. Mm-hmm. And taking a look at the geography of the old world probably wouldn't hurt. But I guess it only matters as it relates to the stories we choose. So,
right.
Yeah, cool. Well, I think we're good then on our history.
Yep.
Unless you have anything else, I'll go ahead and close this out.
No, I give the notes for next time. So, I'm happy that I got those thoughts out so that they're there and we can discuss them when appropriate, because those were the things I was concerned about. So, yeah, I think we're good.
I'm Chris. This is Danny, and this has been the Lacuna Writers Room. We are streaming every Sunday afternoon at 3 p.m. Pacific, and we're going to be continuing to world build our setting here, and then we're going to start going into story building. So we're doing both world building and story building. So tune in on YouTube. I think it's probably the best place to catch us. We're also on Twitch. Both places, Lacuna World, and check us out at lacunaworld.com. The Discord link is there. Join us on Discord, and we will see you next week. Bye.
Bye, everybody.